This is a photo of American soldiers. This photo, the date, we're not positive, 1917 to 1918. The United States actually didn't declare war against the Central Powers, Germany, Austria-Hungary, at that time the Ottoman Empire, until April of 1917. Even after that point, it took some 6 months for the soldiers to become involved there. But these are American soldiers involved in the war in Europe. American soldiers were known as doughboys at the time. And this image actually tells you a lot about how destructive this conflict was just by looking at the scene immediately around these American soldiers. The First World War is fought from 1914 to 1918. And it is sometimes dubbed the war to end all wars, or a war to end all wars. And that is that's a term that comes largely from the American president Woodrow Wilson, that when he started moving towards the United States' involvement in the war, he dubbed this a conflict that should be a war to end all wars. And that really motivated him in some of the end of conflict peace negotiations, was to create a sort of initiative that might make the world more peaceful in the future, and that would end these types of destructive conflicts. The war begins in August of 1914 and it ends in November of 1918 with a victory for the French, the British, the Americans, and their other allies. Issues for the United States during the First World War, things that should be considered, particularly as they relate to the home front during the First World War. Some of the relevant issues that this conflict really brings to light in American history during the 20th century, particularly as they relate to civil liberties, are things like the role of censorship during wartime, and connected to it, propaganda during wartime. This poster here is actually part of the U.S. Creel Committee. It was headed by a guy named George Creel, and it was a propaganda committee created by the Wilson administration to promote the war effort. World War I is not like World War II, where the justification seemed overwhelmingly obvious to the majority of people. It was instead a conflict where there was a great deal of the conflict had to be really kind of sold to the people in many cases to justify why the United States should go across the Atlantic Ocean and become involved in this conflict. And so as a result of that, the United States had an arm of the government called the Creel Committee, which was headed by George Creel, and it was really a propaganda agency during the war. And they created short films, they created posters, they created a myriad of things, magazines, articles in newspapers, all designed to promote the war effort, to encourage people to sign up, and to likewise stifle dissent for the war. There were also controversial speeches, controversial articles, controversial publications that were censored because they were controversial, because they were opposed to the war effort. And so the question to consider here is, during a time of war, to what extent should the government be allowed to censor people's First Amendment rights, the right to free speech? To what extent should they be allowed to compel people not to protest? To what extent should people's right to support or not support the effort, to what extent should that exist during a time of war? There's also issues during this time period related to justice, jurisprudence. During the First World War, the Wilson administration signed into law acts that effectively made it, well, really, in some cases it could be illegal to speak out against the war, whether you were inciting violence or not. In this American history course, we probably will remember the name Eugene V. Debs. Debs was a socialist. He was a union advocate. He also ran for the presidency a number of times. He was a member of the Socialist Party in the United States. And, of course, he was the leader of workers in the Pullman strike of 1894. Well, Debs came out as a staunch opponent of U.S. policy in the First World War, their involvement in the First World War, and he gave a speech in Canton, Ohio, protesting the American involvement in the war. And it wasn't a speech that was telling people to riot or kill people or anything like this. It was a speech where he said American workers should not go and sign up for this conflict, basically. You know, more or less the argument was that this was about money and war makers making money on the conflict. He said Americans should sign up for this. He was in prison. He was given, I believe it was an 8-year prison sentence. He served about 3 years of it. He was released during the presidency of Warren G. Harding in the early 1920s. But the point is during the First World War, speaking out against the war under acts known as the Espionage Act and the Sedition Act, Americans could and were imprisoned for speaking out against the war. We have other issues like that connect to the issue of jurisprudence, of justice, of law. During the war, if you were a German national, meaning you're not an American citizen, you're a German citizen, but you're living in the United States. During the First World War, of course, the primary opponent of the United States was Germany. And German nationals were actually put into internment camps during the First World War. There were some 6,000 German nationals interned, meaning they were arrested and basically put in camps during the war. And so then the question is, and we're going to read a primary source document in this class relating to why some of these people were interned. But the question is, does a government have the right to imprison individuals because of their national identity or likewise their race or ethnicity? Of course, we see Japanese American citizens of Japanese descent imprisoned in the tens of thousands during the Second World War merely because of their ethnicity. And so that's a big important question here is, during a time of war, does the government have the right to imprison individuals on the basis of, if you will, their demographics in society? Other issues to think about: attempts to create world peace. The First World War is actually the first major effort headed up by the United States to create world peace. And during the First World War, we had the creation of the League of Nations, which was like a precursor to the United Nations. And it was designed to be a body of the world powers, of the nation states of the world, that would then allow them to work together to create treaties, to use diplomacy to prevent war. And so we see that as an effort still underway, kind of a precursor to the United Nations, but an effort that begins really at the beginning of the 20th century and is still underway in the 21st century. The efforts to use cooperation on a global level to create greater peace and to prevent conflicts like this. We also have the issue of pandemic diseases. The United States at the end of the First World War, as did much of the world in Western Europe, struggled with the Spanish flu, which was a flu pandemic that actually killed, at that time, upwards of 1 million Americans in about a year, which was more deaths than any American conflict up to that point combined. So these are some of the big issues. What types of rights do people have in America during war to free speech, to the right to protest? To what power should the government or not have to censor publications that are unpopular? To what extent should Americans, the American government, have the right to imprison people without charge or trial? Those are some big questions for the American home front that need to be thought about into the 21st century. I want to give us a little feeling for what kind of conflict this is, and then we'll end this section of the lecture, and we'll talk about some of the things leading to the United States' involvement in the war. So the scale of the calamity here, and it is truly a calamity. Here you see wounded soldiers, British wounded and a German prisoner from the Battle of the Somme. The Battle of the Somme was unprecedented really in its destruction. The Battle of the Somme remains today the most destructive battle in the history of the British military. Today, it remains that devastating. And you see the numbers here. You have some 70 million people mobilized to fight in the war, and of those, nearly 10 million died. Some 21 million were wounded, for a total casualties of roughly 31 million casualties of the military, which is almost half of all forces mobilized for the war. So half, roughly, of all individuals who were mobilized for the war became a casualty. And then you have to add into this the estimated civilian casualties of roughly 7.5 million dead as well. World War I is a war where you see the first air raids, albeit bombardment from the air was pretty primitive at the time. The Germans using the Zeppelins, the airships, and of course there were the small biplanes flown by individuals like Baron von Richthofen or Eddie Rickenbacher that had minimal bombing capabilities, but were largely used for reconnaissance. It's a war of heavy artillery, explosive shells, large artillery pieces that could fire explosive artillery shells, in some cases many miles, 25, 30 miles. And in battles like the Battle of Verdun, the Battle of the Somme, the enemy lines would be barraged with these artillery shells for days on end. Sometimes over 1 million shells would be rained down upon the enemy's lines as one side or the other tried to soften the enemy's lines up to prepare for a coming offensive against that line. It's a war that witnesses the first genocide of the 20th century, the Armenian genocide, which is in modern-day Turkey, in which the government of Turkey today still refuses to acknowledge. Again, it's a war where we see the spread of global pandemic disease. It's a war where we start to begin the process of understanding what PTSD was, though they're a long way away from it. They referred to the trauma of battle as shell shock during the First World War. Eventually, by the latter 20th century, this starts to be understood as post-traumatic stress disorder, as the trauma of conflict on the individuals experiencing it. So it's a very important and relevant conflict, and it's incredibly devastating and destructive war. This is an industrial war. It's a war of attrition. When we say a war of attrition, we mean a war in which the victor is ultimately the one that is able to sacrifice the most in the conflict. The winner is the one that can last the longest. World War I was not a war that was won because one side or the other had a general who was able to outmaneuver the other. It wasn't a war in which one side had a Napoleon Bonaparte who, was really savvy at understanding his enemy. It was a war where two sides became stalemated in an industrial conflict, and both attempted to use industrial military power to gain the advantage. But none of the technologies of war were able to gain such an advantage that they could overwhelm the enemy. And so it became a drawn-out industrial war of attrition. One of the reasons why those casualty numbers are so high. So you witness in this war a war of trenches, where after the first 6 months on the Western Front, in places like Belgium and France, the war literally went subterranean. It went underground. They built trenches, tunnels, and you actually, you operated on the front lines. You never went above the trench unless you were going to launch an invasion on the enemy lines, an offensive on enemy lines. You slept in a bunker underground. You were deployed in trenches, sometimes full of mud, where rats and other maladies sort of befell the soldiers in those trenches when they were very muddy from rain in places like, again, Belgium and France on the Western Front. It's a stalemated war where no side really has the advantage. In battles like Verdun in western or eastern France, and the Battle of the Somme, which is fought in Belgium, these are incredibly destructive battles. The Battle of the Somme, 20,000 died on the first day of the battle. And ultimately, at the end of both of these battles that go on for weeks and weeks and weeks, no side gained much more than maybe a few hundred yards, maybe in some cases a mile or two. Generally speaking, all of the people that died in battles like the Battle of Verdun or the Battle of the Somme, when those battles ended, the positions of either side were more or less unchanged. It's a war of naval blockades. The British, particularly, as you see here, the British Navy on the high seas, the British blockaded the German coast with the goal of denying the Germans and the Central Powers the supplies necessary to fight the war. And it was believed that eventually, if you were able to do this long enough, that eventually the German government and the German population would collapse and be unable to continue the war. So it's a war. It's an industrial war of attrition. It's a war that brought some of the most cutting-edge and also horrifying technologies to the battlefield. The goal with these, of course, being to gain an advantage in the war. Here you see, of course, the use of poison gas in the war. Poison gas technologies included chlorine gas, mustard gas. And of course, these remain relevant in the 21st century, as in the Syrian civil war, we've seen poison gas used numerous times in violation of international law. And of course, during the First World War, the use of poison gas, first by Germany, but ultimately by both sides, will lead to international agreements in the aftermath of the war to ban the use of poison gas in warfare. So you see from the First World War some further steps being taken. Not the first ones, but further steps being taken to create sort of rules of combat and standards of international law. Very relevant today in the 21st century. Tanks emerged in the First World War, very primitive tanks, albeit this is a Canadian unit with a British tank, and these were not consequential. They didn't make a big difference, largely because of how they were deployed strategically and also because the technology was not very effective. The tanks went maybe 5 miles an hour. They used to fill up with carbon monoxide inside of them, so it was very nauseating, really, for the individuals driving it. They broke down all the time. And so really they were just kind of used for troop support, and they were not decisive technologies in the war. The machine gun is one of the reasons why the war became so stalemated. This weapon that emerged with the Industrial Revolution, it really began to be developed in the late 1800s, a true weapon of war that connects to the Industrial Revolution. This weapon, while it very much facilitated the colonization of Africa and other parts of the world by European powers, when employed by both sides in a conflict like World War I in Western Europe, it meant that both sides had an overwhelming amount of firepower to repulse an enemy offensive. And so the machine gun is probably the most devastating component of the war, as units would go over the top, as it was said, out of the trenches, and they would launch linear sort of infantry assaults on the enemy's positions, the enemy's lines, and the enemy would have these machine guns that would then be able to fire many, many bullets a minute at the charging troops and effectively mow them down. These are British soldiers, by the way. These are British soldiers at the Battle of Passchendaele in Belgium. It's a war that witnesses the real effective use of submarines, or the Unterseeboot, the German U-boat. And the U-boat was very important for German naval warfare. And while there was, of course, earlier submarines used like the CSS Hunley in the Civil War, and there was even primitive, like experimental submarines in the American Revolutionary War, the first really effective application of submarines comes during the First World War, and the submarine, the U-boat, will have a real significant impact on why the United States becomes involved in the conflict. This is the largest of the heavy guns of the First World War. It's a rail gun. Most artillery guns during the First World War are not this big, but this just speaks to the scale that some of these weapons took. At the Battle of the Somme, when the British launched an offensive against German lines, they lobbed some 1.5 million rounds on the enemy lines in a 7-day period. An incredible amount, and many of these are not just shells by themselves. They're explosive shells that are designed to explode upon contact. And so this turns the landscape into a moonscape of craters, and it's incredibly destructive. The reason that this was done is they thought you attack the enemy lines with artillery barrages for days in a row, and then the thinking was there wouldn't be a consistent and strong enemy line left, and then you would launch the offensive against it, and you would be able to break through where the enemy lines were. But both sides, they dug these deep trenches, these bunkers that went well into the earth. And every time, more or less, you have that kind of an assault, the offensive of the infantry on the enemy lines finds that the enemy is intact and able to fight and repulse the infantry assault. This is Eddie Rickenbacher. He's an American. He's the most notable American fighter pilot during the First World War. And so aerial technology is in its infancy. It's not really it's important for reconnaissance, but it's not decisive again. And of course, over here is a flyer using the threat of a Zeppelin air raid to encourage those to enlist. Interestingly, though, Eddie Rickenbacher is a very interesting American story because Eddie Rickenbacher changed the spelling of his name. He was of German heritage. And he actually changed the spelling of his name because there was so much anti-German hysteria in the United States. He probably would not have been allowed to enlist, and he would not have been allowed to serve had they known that he was of German descent. So there was a great deal of anti-German animosity. Sauerkraut, even, for example, was named Victory Cabbage during the First World War. And a lot of this was built up by the propaganda of groups like the Creel Committee, the propaganda committee of the United States. So Eddie Rickenbacher, who, by the way, he owned the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, where the Indy 500 is raced, until the Second World War. He helped to establish a very significant, it's now defunct, but American airline agency. He was a very prominent figure in American society, aside from being the most decorated American fighter pilot during the First World War. And he probably would not have been able to do that had it been clear that he was of German heritage. So it speaks to how significant the war was to domestic realities in the United States.